I just replaced my bathroom floor from start to finish. That means demo, installing waterproofing membrane, tile layout with a bunch of tricky cuts, installing the tile itself, then finally grouting and cleaning. And I did all this with almost no tiling experience. And I won't lie, I made a few mistakes. But tiling is doable even if you're not a pro. You just need a few tools and a little knowledge, so follow along and figure out one way to tile a floor. I start with demo, and my first job is to pull up these old tile. I use a hammer to break up these edge tiles so I can fit my pry bar underneath. I'm using this small pry bar that's sometimes called a cat's paw or a molding lifter, but it works for almost everything. It's easily maneuverable and can pop most of these tiles out in one piece. I got this pry bar and most of the tools you'll see me use here from this video's sponsor, Shag Tools. More about them later in the video, but for now I continue to use my hammer and pry bar to pull up these tiles. I got pretty lucky here because the tile is set directly on plywood. If it was set on concrete or a waterproofing membrane, this process would take longer and the tiles would break apart into smaller pieces, but the steps would be the same regardless. Drive your pry bar in with the hammer, pop your tiles up, move on to the next one, and for any stubborn sections, use your hammer to break the tile into shards. But these shards can be sharp, so next time I'll make sure to wear gloves and some knee pads to make this process a little more comfortable. Once my last tile is up, I can move on to scraping the leftover mortar and grout up. I'm using a couple of different scrapers here. This red one is made by Crane and is great for tight areas. And this larger adjustable one, also from Crane, removes a ton of material quickly in the larger spaces. I switch between these two until my floor is clean. And huge bonus tip here that I didn't figure out until way too late in the process, but adding a little water to the floor makes the scraping way easier. Everything comes up faster and the moisture helps to keep the dust out of the air, so definitely give this a shot. Before moving on, I need to fill this gap in the floor that was left over from the old shower. I measure the gap and mark out my shape on some 1/2-inch plywood, then use my homemade track for my circular saw and cut out the pieces I need to fill in the gap. I add plenty of screws to hold it into place and make sure my screw heads are below the surface of my plywood. With my floor now flat, level, and free of mortar, I can prep for my uncoupling membrane. I'll be using Ditra from Schluter for this because it's easy to use and works so well. I roll out the Ditra, mark it for length, and make my first cut using a utility knife. Then I can mark for the openings I need for my water lines and make those cuts in the same way. And once I check their fit, I move on to my second piece. First, I cut it to length, then mark it for width and add this jog out for the doorway. This time I make my cuts with a pair of scissors, which also works great. And if you're unsure of what this orange stuff is used for, then you're not alone. Ditra is an uncoupling membrane, meaning that it creates a separation between the wood subfloor, which has natural movement, and the tile, which doesn't. Now when the subfloor expands and contracts over time, the tile won't crack. Ditra also bonds super well to both the subfloor and to the tile, so that no tile ever comes loose. It also works as waterproofing as long as your seams and edges are sealed. So if you wanted to turn this whole room into a pool, you could. It's great stuff and I'd definitely recommend it for any tile floor. I've decided not to seal the seams in this room. The chances of a catastrophic leak in a half bath with no washing machine is pretty low. But if I was working on a shower, or even a full bath, I'd take the extra step, pick up some Curdy band, and seal those seams. I measure, mark, and cut for the toilet flange and for the water supply line. Now all my Ditra is cut and fit to my bathroom's floor, but it has a tendency to keep the rounded shape gained from being rolled up, so I was given the tip to set it aside face down until I'm ready to use it, so that it has a chance to flatten out. I give the floor another cleaning with a damp sponge to remove any leftover dust, and if you're working with plywood as a subfloor, it can act as a wick and pull moisture out of the thin set too quickly, causing it to dry prematurely, which could potentially cause cracks. But no worries, just make sure to dampen your subfloor before applying your thin set, and you're good to go. I posted this part of the project as a short, and got a lot of comments asking if I had actually dampened the floor. This got me thinking, maybe I should have put even more water on the subfloor before adding the thin set. If you've worked with Ditra before, or if you have any other insight, I'd love to know if you think I didn't get this floor quite damp enough, got it too wet, or if I Goldilocksed it. Let me know in the comments. I grab a 5-gallon bucket, my Ruby mixer, and a bag of thin set. I'm going for Schluter All Set, which is recommended when working with Ditra. When installing Ditra, the thin set should be mixed thinner than when laying tile, but still be able to hold a notch. Luckily for me, the back of the All Set bag shows me how much water is needed for either mix I'm looking for. I followed the recommendations for installing Ditra and didn't need to stress about whether I was getting it right. I followed the mixing instructions on the bag as well, by mixing for 5 minutes, then letting the thin set slake by setting untouched for 10 minutes, then mixing again for 3. With my thin set mixed up and ready to go, I grab my trowel, load it up, and start to spread it out using its flat side. This trowel is made by Schluter and is made to work specifically with Ditra and has a notch side of just under 1/4 inch. Once the first strip of the floor is covered with a thin layer of thin set, I flip my trowel and add more thin set with the notched side. Then I lay my Ditra into place. And with the Ditra lined up correctly, I grab a rubber float and press it down firmly onto the Ditra, embedding it into the thin set below. While you work, it's good to take some time to pull up a corner and make sure that you're getting good adhesion between the thin set and the fleece lining of the Ditra. Once your first sheet is laid, have your second at the ready and continue to spread your thin set. This trowel has a notched long and short side, as well as a flat long and short side. I mostly use the long side of each, but in corners or around tight obstacles like this toilet flange, the short side came in really handy. Continue this process until your whole floor is covered, and try not to stress. I find myself worrying whenever I'm working with a material that has a finite amount of working time, but this all set has a nice long pot life, and with a small bathroom like this, there's no need to worry too much about it hardening before you install all your Ditra. Save that worry for later when you're laying the tile. You'll need it, or at least I did. Now it's time to lay out the tile how we want it on the floor. I start by taking my full pieces and laying them out in the pattern that I like. I'm going with a 1/3 offset for these 12 by 24 inch tiles. That means the first cuts I need to make are these. One that's 2/3 of a tile and one that's 1/3. I'm going to make these cuts with a tile cutter from Ruby. I mark a tile, set the scoring wheel, push down and score the tile, and this is the sound you're looking for. Once scored, set the breaking foot on the edge of the tile, give the handle a firm push down, and get a clean break.
Oh, that's awesome.
Then you're looking for this sound.
Yes.
Set your tile into place using the spacers you plan on using when setting the tile. Then move on to the next gap in your pattern. For this cut, we start with a 1/3 of a tile and then cut it to width. Next, we get a full-length tile, but this one needs to be cut to 2 different widths. Start by cutting the tile to the thicker of your 2 widths, then mark for the thinner. Next, I take a diamond cutting wheel attached to my angle grinder and cut to my marked line. Back at the tile cutter, I make one more score to the crosscut that I just made. Setting the breaking foot before my crosscut, I make my break. It's a little messy, but it fits in just fine. Oh, and in case you were wondering, this transition is an inch thick and made of marble, and it's still no match for this tile cutter. Next, we have a mirror image of our last tile, but let's see if we can get it a little cleaner this time. Mark, score, and cut to your thickest measurement. Make your crosscut, and be sure to keep it wet to decrease the heat and avoid cracking. I like this water can trick to keep fresh water on the tile the whole time. Score and break your tile on the thinner line, set it and forget it. For tile that abuts a wall, I like to keep a 1/4 inch gap between the edge of the tile and the wall. I'm just using a piece of cardboard as a spacer here. The next tile needs 2 holes for my water lines. I mark them in place and make my cuts with some water, my drill, and a 3/4 inch diamond hole saw. Set it in place and you're good. But don't forget about this little guy. These next 2 tiles need round cuts for the toilet flange. I mark these with a circle of the same size and use my angle grinder to make the cuts. I broke my first tile, the second one was a little sloppy but worked, and the third one came out pretty good. I set them in place and could move on to my last couple of tiles. These cuts are specific to the bathroom, but the techniques and the tools covered for these cuts should cover most or all of the cuts in any room you're working on. Once all my tiles are in place, I can take them out, set them aside, and get ready for more thin set. I again mix my thin set to the recommended water to mix rate for a setting tile. Then mix, slake, and mix again. With my cardboard spacers against the wall, I add a layer of thin set with the flat side of my trowel. Then flip it and add another layer with the notch side. And if you've tiled before, you may have noticed my mistake here. A large format tile like I'm using should be set with a trowel with a 1/2 inch notch or at least a 3/8 inch. But I'm using a trowel that only has a 1/4 inch notch. Everything turned out alright though because of my good foundation of Ditra and this next step, back buttering each tile before install. But if you're looking to use a tile of this size, make sure to pick up a larger trowel. Back buttering is the process of adding thin set to the back of your tile with the flat side of your trowel. The goal isn't to build up much thickness, but to fill in the voids on your tile and make sure that you have a good thin set to thin set connection. Set your tile in place and don't forget to add spacers between each tile. I'm using these awesome cyclone spacers from Ruby that not only space accurately but also level your tile. Just spin the caps onto the base of each spacer and tighten them to ensure your 2 tiles are level. And make sure when applying thin set that your notches are perpendicular to the long side of your tile. In this case, that means the lines are going the direction of the 12-inch side of my tile. And once you set your tile, make sure to wiggle it back and forth along the long side of the tile to collapse your notches and get the best adhesion possible. As I mentioned earlier, I was feeling the stress while laying these tile. It felt like all this hard work had led to this moment, and that messing it up now would be a real bummer. I also had a ticking clock to think about. All set has a 3 to 4 hour pot life, and I was really hoping to get this whole floor laid in one setting. My best advice here is to prep everything that you can beforehand. I was really happy to know that all my tile was cut and fit for this floor, and when I go to grab a piece, I know that it will fit. And if nothing else, make sure that you're using a leveling system. For pros, it makes leveling way easier, but for a beginner like me, I don't think it would have been possible without one. When placing my spacers, I found it helpful to remove a small amount of thin set along the side of the tile. This made the spacer fit more easily and less squeeze out to happen when I laid the next tile. And once it hardens, that squeeze out is a real pain to clean up. This 45 square foot room took me the whole 3 hours of pot life that I had to finish. But there's a few things that I can do differently next time to help speed up the process. It took me till almost the end to find a good order of operations, but what I found worked for me was to pick up a tile with my suction cup, flip it over and back butter it, then while still attached to the suction cup, set it in place, wiggle to collapse my notch lines, remove the suction cup, then add and tighten my leveling caps. Continue this process until you make it to the end, and make sure you have a plan to get out of the room you're working in without stepping on the newly laid tile. This project wasn't always easy, but it really is doable. Just remember these techniques and have the tools that you need to get the job done. If you don't have the tools you need, shagtools.com is a great resource. Their website's easy to use and doesn't bog you down with things you don't need. They focus on quality flooring supplies for pros and beginners. They've got fair pricing and fast shipping that's free on many orders. To find a link to all the tools and supplies that I used in this video, check out the link in the description. And thanks again to Shag Tools. Now let's work on cleaning up the mess we've made. Leave the caps on your spacers and start to kick them loose. Just make sure to kick with the seam and not against it. And to slide your foot on the ground, kicking as low as possible. Do both of these and give a nice solid kick, and you'll have clean breaks every time. Keep this up until all your spacers are free, then sweep them up and set them aside. But make sure to keep these because the caps are reusable. I didn't put enough confidence into a couple of my kicks, and my pegs broke above the floor. If this happens to you, no big deal. Just grab some pliers and pull the base out. With my floor clear, I used some tile cleaning spray and a tile scraper to remove the dry thinset that was stuck to the floor. There was quite a bit of it, but it all came up with no issues. I also keep a grout saw close by in case I need to lower the thinset between the tiles. Once clean, I mix up some Mapei Ultracolor grout, grab my rubber float, and start to work it into the seams. When grouting, try to hold your float at an angle and make sure you're getting as deep as possible into the seams with your grout. And don't worry about adding too much grout here. Just make sure that you have enough and your seams are full, and we'll get it all cleaned up in the next step. I worked my way from one side of the room to the other, and finish by the door, just like I did when laying tile. As soon as I'm done installing the grout, I can start to clean in the section that I started in. I'm using a couple of different sponges for this. The first is this large one made by Raimondi that has a handle which makes it really easy to use. I hold the sponge at an angle like I did with my float, and pull towards myself, removing the excess grout from the surface of the tile, and lowering the grout line slightly below the tile. When grouting, the most important thing is to keep a clean sponge. A bucket of water works fine for this, but I'm using this cleaning station also from Raimondi, which helps me work a little faster and be sure that my sponge is clean and damp but not oversaturated. I also like these hand sponges from Ruby, which work great for this and a lot of other cleaning applications as well. Once your floor is cleaned and all the excess grout is removed, it's best to let the grout dry for a few hours before walking on the floor. But after that, I can call this stage of the project done and enjoy this beautiful new floor. It's flat, solid, and my grout lines are straight and a 1/16 of an inch thick, just like my spacers promised. I really am so happy with the final results of this floor, and you can absolutely get these results too, even if you're just starting out. One last huge thank you to Shag Tools for sponsoring this video. Make sure to check them out for all your flooring supply needs. We've still got a lot of work to do in this bathroom to make it usable, including a tiled backsplash, new vanity, and some custom cabinets. To make sure you don't miss out on that or any of our other upcoming projects, get subscribed to One Way to Make, and thanks so much for watching.